For most of human history, the way people spoke was as diverse as the communities they came from. Every region, every social class, every ethnic group had distinctive vocal characteristics. A person's voice carried information about where they were raised, what social class they belonged to, what their parents spoke. There was no correct way to speak, no standard against which all voices were measured. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, something fundamental changed. Institutions began systematically studying speech, measuring vocal characteristics, and developing standards for proper pronunciation. Schools implemented elocution programs, teaching children to speak according to prescribed patterns. The emerging broadcast industries promoted voices that conformed to narrow specifications, and scientists developed technologies for analyzing vocal production, creating frameworks for understanding speech as a mechanical process that could be optimized and standardized. The elocution movement creates standards. On the 15th of March, 1826, the American Elocution Society held its founding meeting in Philadelphia. The organization's charter, preserved at Historical Society of Pennsylvania, stated its purpose as promoting correct and elegant speech through scientific principles. Founding President Jonathan Barber, professor at Harvard, argued in his inaugural address that natural speech patterns were deficient and required systematic correction through training. Barber published Practical Treatise on Gesture in 1831. The manual provided detailed instructions on posture, breathing, tongue placement, and vocal production. Page 47 specified that speakers should stand with weight evenly distributed, shoulders back, and chest expanded to maximize breath control. Page 63 described proper tongue position for producing each vowel sound, with diagrams showing anatomical positioning. The manual was adopted by schools across New England. Boston Public Schools required elocution instruction beginning in 1837. The school committee's annual report from June 1838 noted that students were making progress in eliminating regional speech defects, specifically mentioning correction of Irish and Italian immigrant children's pronunciation. In 1848, Alexander Melville Bell published The Principles of Speech and Vocal Physiology in Edinburgh. Bell, father of telephone inventor Alexander Graham Bell, created a system called visible speech that used symbols to represent exact position of tongue, lips, and throat required to produce each sound. The system, detailed on pages 33 through 81, allowed systematic description and teaching of speech production. Bell's visible speech was introduced to American schools in 1870s. The Boston School for the Deaf adopted it in 1871. Sarah Fuller, the school's principal, reported in her 1872 annual report that visible speech enabled deaf students to learn speech by following precise mechanical instructions rather than by imitating sounds they could not hear. But visible speech was also used with hearing students to correct natural speech. The New York public school system adopted it in 1875 for teaching immigrant children standard English. School Superintendent William Wood stated in his 1876 report that visible speech provided objective basis for correcting deficient pronunciation, allowing teachers to specify exactly how students' natural speech deviated from proper standards. The science of phonetics. The International Phonetic Association was founded in Paris in 1886 by Paul Passy. The association's journal, published beginning in 1889, promoted creation of universal phonetic alphabet that could precisely transcribe any human speech sound. The first version of International Phonetic Alphabet appeared in the association's 1888 journal, containing 52 symbols representing distinct speech sounds. The IPA provided tool for standardization. With precise notation system, linguists could describe standard pronunciation scientifically and measure deviations from it quantitatively. A speaker's pronunciation could be transcribed in IPA and compared to standard transcription to identify specific errors requiring correction. American linguist William Dwight Whitney used IPA in his 1889 analysis of American English dialects. Whitney's study, published in American Journal of Philology, documented pronunciation patterns across different regions and social classes. On pages 123 through 147, Whitney classified pronunciations as standard, acceptable, or deficient based on educated Northeastern speech patterns. Southern, rural, and working-class pronunciations were consistently classified as deficient. This classification was not merely descriptive, it was prescriptive. Whitney's work was cited in educational materials and teacher training programs. The pronunciations he marked as deficient became targets for correction in schools. The Broadcasting Voice Revolution. On the 2nd of November 1920, radio station KDKA in Pittsburgh broadcast the Harding-Cox presidential election returns. This was one of America's first commercial radio broadcasts. Station engineer Frank Conrad noted in his technical log that vocal clarity was a major challenge. Some speakers' voices transmitted well through the equipment. Others became distorted or incomprehensible. By 1922, radio stations had developed preferences for certain vocal characteristics. WEAF in New York, which began broadcasting in 1922, established voice standards for announcers. Station manager Samuel Ross specified in memo dated the 7th of April 1922 that announcers should have mid-range pitch, clear articulation, and neutral accent without regional characteristics. Ross stated that voices that were too low, too high, or that carried strong regional markers did not transmit well and were unacceptable for broadcasting. The National Broadcasting Company, formed in 1926, formalized these preferences. NBC created Pronunciation Committee in 1926 to establish standards for all on-air speech. The committee, chaired by linguist Frank Visitelli, issued rulings on correct pronunciation that announcers were required to follow. The committee's decisions, published in NBC Handbook of Pronunciation from 1943, specified exact pronunciation for thousands of words. The Mid-Atlantic accent emerged from these broadcasting standards. This accent, neither fully American nor British, was taught at American Academy of Dramatic Arts beginning in 1920s. Academy director Charles Jellinger stated in 1925 interview with New York Times that stage speech should transcend regional origins and represent cultivated, educated standard. The Mid-Atlantic accent became model for professional speakers, actors, and broadcasters. The educational enforcement. New York City Public Schools implemented comprehensive speech training program beginning in 1895. Superintendent William Maxwell's 1896 annual report described the program's goals as eliminating deficient speech patterns among immigrant children and establishing standard English pronunciation. The report, pages 73 through 89, detailed methods including daily pronunciation drills, correction of home language influence, and penalties for students who persisted in using non-standard speech. Teacher Emma Willard published account of her experiences in 1903 book Americanizing the Immigrant. Willard taught at elementary school in Lower East Side, where most students came from Yiddish, Italian, or Polish-speaking families. On pages 42 through 51, Willard described requiring students to repeat English words dozens of times until pronunciation met standards. Students who could not modify their accents were kept after school for additional drills. Willard stated that some students cried during these sessions, but that such correction was necessary for their future success. The punishment for non-standard speech was documented in multiple schools. Philadelphia School District records from 1908 show that students could be held back a grade if their speech did not meet standards, regardless of academic performance. The district's 1909 guidelines, preserved at Philadelphia Board of Education archives, specified that clear, standard English speech was prerequisite for promotion to higher grades. Southern speech received particular attention. The Atlanta public school system implemented speech correction program in 1912, specifically targeting Southern pronunciation. Superintendent William Slayton's report from June 1913 stated that Southern accent hindered students' prospects for employment outside the region and should be eliminated through systematic training. The report recommended that teachers model Northern pronunciation and correct any deviation from it. The African American Experience. The Hampton Institute in Virginia, founded in 1868 for education of freed slaves, included extensive speech training in its curriculum. Hampton's founder, Samuel Chapman Armstrong, stated in 1872 address that proper English speech was essential for racial advancement. Armstrong's address, reprinted in Southern Workman in March 1872, explicitly described African American speech patterns as deficient and requiring correction. Hampton employed white teachers from the North to model standard speech. Teacher Helen Ludlow wrote in 1882 article for Harper's Monthly that Hampton students arrived speaking what she called plantation English and underwent systematic retraining. On pages 433 through 437, Ludlow described daily elocution drills and correction of grammatical and pronunciation patterns associated with African American speech. Booker T. Washington, Hampton graduate who founded Tuskegee Institute in 1881, adopted similar approach. Washington stated in his 1895 Atlanta Exposition address that African Americans must master standard English to gain white acceptance. Tuskegee's curriculum included mandatory speech classes. Washington's 1901 autobiography, Up from Slavery, describes on pages 87 through 92 his own efforts to eliminate traces of his childhood speech and adopt educated Northern pronunciation, but not et. All black educators agreed. W.E.B. Du Bois criticized this approach in his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. On pages 51 through 53, Du Bois argued that forcing African Americans to abandon their natural speech patterns was cultural violence that validated white supremacy. Du Bois himself spoke standard English, but questioned whether that standard should be universal requirement. The institutional coordination. The Rockefeller Foundation funded study of speech standardization between 1915 and 1923. Foundation archives in Sleepy Hollow, New York, contain correspondence discussing concerns about linguistic diversity in immigrant communities. Letter dated November 12, 1917, from Foundation Director George Vincent to researcher Edward Thorndike, requested analysis of whether speech training could accelerate immigrant assimilation. Thorndike's report, submitted in March 1918, recommended comprehensive speech training programs in public schools serving immigrant populations. The report, preserved in Rockefeller archives, argued that standard English speech was prerequisite for effective industrial workforce and that linguistic diversity impeded efficient communication in factories. Thorndike specifically recommended that schools eliminate use of foreign languages and non-standard English dialects. The Foundation funded implementation of Thorndike's recommendations in New York, Chicago, and Detroit school systems between 1919 and 1923. Total funding exceeded $200,000, equivalent to approximately $3 million today. The programs trained teachers in speech correction techniques and provided materials for pronunciation drills. Factory managers supported these efforts. In 1920, the National Association of Manufacturers published report Language Standardization in Industrial Settings. The report, archived at Hagley Museum in Delaware, recommended that factories require standard English and that workers with strong accents be assigned to positions without customer contact. Multiple companies adopted these policies through 1920s, the broadcasting standards formalized. In 1943, NBC published its Handbook of Pronunciation with detailed rulings on correct pronunciation for broadcast speech. The handbook, compiled over 17 years by NBC's Pronunciation Committee, specified pronunciation for over 20,000 words. Introduction by committee chairman Frank Visitelli stated that standardized pronunciation was necessary for national broadcasting and that regional variations were unacceptable for professional broadcasters. The handbook's rulings favored educated Northeastern pronunciation. Words with variant pronunciations in different regions were standardized to Eastern forms. Page 347 specified that economic should be pronounced with long E, not short E, as in most of American South. Page 512 specified that either should use long I, not long E, as in many Midwestern dialects. CBS established similar standards in 1940s. William Paley, CBS president, stated in 1947 memo to programming staff that announcers must speak general American English without regional characteristics. The memo, preserved in CBS archives at Museum of Television and Radio, specified that Southern, New York, and Western accents were unacceptable for network broadcasting. These standards extended beyond news and announcers to entertainment programming. CBS and NBC required that actors playing educated or authoritative characters use standard pronunciation. Regional accents were permitted only for comedy or for characters explicitly marked as rural, working class, or ethnic. The physiological research. In 1952, acoustic researcher Ralph Potter at Bell Telephone Laboratories developed the sound spectrograph. This device, described in Potter's article in Journal of Acoustic Society of America, could visualize speech sounds as graphic patterns showing frequency content over time. The spectrograph made possible precise analysis and comparison of speech production. Bell Labs used spectrographs to study telephone transmission of different accents and speech patterns. Research report from 1954, authored by John Reisch and technical staff, concluded that standard American pronunciation transmitted more clearly through telephone equipment than regional or ethnic speech patterns. The report recommended that telephone operators be trained in standard pronunciation to maximize transmission clarity. This research was cited by educators and speech pathologists as scientific justification for speech standardization. If standard pronunciation transmitted better through communications technology, then teaching that pronunciation served practical purpose beyond mere preference. The technology created feedback loop, reinforcing existing standards. The cost of resistance. Linguistic insecurity, the feeling that one's natural speech is inadequate, was documented in multiple psychological studies from 1950s onward. William Labov's 1966 study, The Social Stratification of English in New York City, based on interviews with New York residents, found that working-class speakers showed high levels of anxiety about their pronunciation and frequently attempted to modify their speech in formal contexts. Labov documented on pages 320 through 343 that speakers who grew up with non-standard pronunciation often felt ashamed of their natural speech and experienced stress when required to speak. In professional settings, some avoided situations requiring public speaking. Others developed split identities, maintaining different speech patterns for home and work contexts. The employment consequences were documented in multiple studies. In 1977, linguist John Bohr conducted research on employment discrimination based on accent. Bohr, who is African American, made identical phone inquiries about job listings using standard English pronunciation and African American English pronunciation. His study, published in Language in Society in 1981, found that callbacks for interviews were significantly more likely when he used standard pronunciation. Landlords were also more likely to invite apartment viewings when callers used standard rather than African American English. Similar discrimination affected other accented speakers. Study by Rosina Lippi-Green, published in 1997 book English with an Accent, documented systematic disadvantages faced by speakers with Southern, Hispanic, and Asian accents in employment and education. The study showed that even when speech was perfectly comprehensible, non-standard accents triggered negative judgments about intelligence, competence, and trustworthiness. The modern continuation. Voice recognition technology developed since 1990s has created new standardization pressure. Early speech recognition systems were trained primarily on standard American English, spoken by educated professionals. The systems performed poorly with regional accents, ethnic speech patterns, and non-native speakers. Research by Rachel Tatman, published in 2017, analyzed performance of automatic speech recognition systems across different demographics. Tatman's study, presented at Conference on Ethics in Artificial Intelligence, found that recognition accuracy was significantly lower for African American speakers, Southern speakers, and speakers with heavy accents. The technology effectively discriminated by encoding existing prejudices about whose speech was normal and whose was deficient. This technological bias creates practical barriers. Voice-activated systems, customer service automation, and voice-controlled devices work less well for speakers with non-standard pronunciation. This forces adaptation to standard speech or exclusion from technology use. Corporate call centers have intensified speech standardization. Companies outsourcing customer service to India, Philippines, and other countries train workers extensively in American or British accent neutralization. Workers spend months learning to eliminate their natural accents and adopt standard pronunciation. This training, documented in studies of call center labor, is experienced by many workers as erasure of identity and cultural heritage. What was lost? The standardization of voice eliminated linguistic diversity that had existed for centuries. Regional vocabularies, words and expressions existing only in specific dialects have been extensively lost as speakers converge towards standard language. The richness of local expression diminished. The emotional and aesthetic dimensions of voice varied across cultures and regions in ways that were not adequately documented before standardization eliminated much of the variation. The musicality of speech, the rhythms and intonations making each variety distinctive, survive only in recordings when they were made at all. Perhaps most significantly, the connection between voice and identity was severed for millions of speakers forced to modify their natural speech. When your voice marks you as uneducated or deficient, maintaining authentic voice means accepting social and economic penalties. Adopting standard voice means performing identity that may feel fraudulent. Neither option is satisfactory. The standardization succeeded completely enough that most people now experience standard speech as natural rather than constructed. The fact that General American or received pronunciation represents specific regional and class origins has been obscured. What began as elevation of particular varieties to standard status through institutional action became experienced as simply how educated people speak. The artificiality of standards became invisible. What the pattern reveals is how institutions shape fundamental aspects of human behavior. The standardization of voice was not natural or inevitable, but was achieved through deliberate institutional action, combining education, media, technology, and economic pressure. The process operated through ordinary mechanisms that made standardization seem like obvious choice to individuals, making isolated decisions about their own speech or their children's education. No conspiracy was required. Just ordinary institutional logic operating without consideration of what might be lost. The human voice was standardized through accumulation of small decisions that collectively transformed how millions of people spoke. Whether this was progress or loss depends on whether one values practical benefits of standardization or diversity and authenticity that were sacrificed to achieve it. What cannot be denied is that the transformation occurred, that it was not accidental, and that its consequences continue to affect who is heard and believed in contemporary society. The theatrical voice standards. The American Academy of Dramatic Arts, founded in New York in 1884, established formal training program for stage speech. Founder Franklin Sargent stated in the Academy's 1885 prospectus that natural speech was inadequate for theatre and required systematic cultivation. The prospectus, preserved in Academy archives, specified that students would undergo daily voice training to eliminate regional characteristics and develop elevated speech suitable for dramatic performance. By 1900, the Academy had formalized the stage speech curriculum. Instructor Bessie Tyree published The Art of Speech in 1903, describing the training methods. On pages 97 through 112, Tyree detailed exercises for developing what she called theatrical voice, characterized by precise articulation, elevated pitch patterns, and elimination of regional markers. Students practiced speaking Shakespeare and other classical texts to internalize these patterns. The stage speech, taught at AADA, became model for professional broadcasting. When NBC and CBS hired announcers in 1920s and 1930s, they preferentially selected individuals with theatrical training. The vocal patterns developed for stage performance transferred directly to radio broadcasting, creating continuity between theatrical and broadcast speech standards. Hollywood reinforced these standards through sound films, beginning in 1927. MGM established speech department in 1929, headed by Gertrude Fogler. Studio records show that actors with strong regional accents were required to undergo speech modification before being cast in major roles. Jimmy Stewart, who grew up in Pennsylvania, worked with Fogler to modify his natural accent. Katharine Hepburn from Connecticut similarly underwent training to develop the patrician accent she used in films. The cost of code switching. Research on cognitive burden of code switching. Maintaining multiple speech varieties and selecting which to use based on context began appearing in linguistics journals in 1980s. Study by Carol Myers-Scotton, published in 1988, analysed African American professionals who maintained vernacular speech at home and standard English at work. The study, appearing in Language in Society, found that constant monitoring required significant cognitive resources and created psychological stress. Myers-Scotton documented on pages 412 through 437 that speakers reported feeling exhausted by need to monitor and adjust their speech continuously. Some described feeling inauthentic in professional contexts. Others reported tension with family members who viewed their standard speech as betrayal of community identity. The phenomenon extended beyond African American speakers. Study by Carmen Fort, published in 2003, examined Chicano English speakers in Los Angeles. Fort's research, published in Journal of Linguistic Anthropology, found that Mexican American students who code-switched between Chicano English and Standard English at school experienced similar stress and identity conflicts. The psychological toll was quantified in research by Ilan Stavens, published in 2010. Stavens measured cortisol levels in bilingual speakers who code-switched frequently compared to monolingual speakers and found elevated stress hormones associated with linguistic monitoring. The research suggested that requiring speakers to modify their natural speech patterns creates measurable physiological stress. The Immigration Experience, the Dillingham Commission, established by Congress in 1907 to study immigration, published 42-volume report between 1911 and 1913. Volume 8, devoted to immigrant education, recommended intensive English instruction emphasizing pronunciation. The report, preserved in National Archives, stated on pages 320 through 341 that immigrant retention of foreign accents impeded assimilation and should be prevented through early childhood intervention. These recommendations were implemented through Americanization programs in 1910s and 1920s. Settlement houses, public schools, and adult education programs offered English classes emphasizing accent elimination. The YMCA's Americanization program, documented in their 1918 annual report, trained over 150,000 immigrants in standard English pronunciation between 1915 and 1920. Student experiences in these programs were documented in oral histories collected in 1990s. Maria Zambrano, interviewed in 1996 at age 94, described attending night school in Chicago in 1923, where Italian immigrants were drilled in English pronunciation. Zambrano recalled in interview, archived at Chicago History Museum, that teacher would rap students' knuckles with ruler when they mispronounced words. Zambrano stated she learned to speak without accent but felt ashamed of her parents' speech for years afterward. Similar accounts appear in interviews with Jewish immigrants. Samuel Goldstein, interviewed in 1994, described attending public school in New York in 1918, where Yiddish-speaking children were punished for using Yiddish words or Yiddish-influenced pronunciation. Goldstein's interview, archived at Museum of Jewish Heritage, describes teacher making him stand in corner with sign reading, "I will speak proper English," when he used Yiddish intonation. The gender dimension. Women's voices received particular regulatory attention. Conduct manuals from late 1800s specified appropriate vocal qualities for respectable women. The Ladies' Book of Etiquette by Florence Hartley, published in 1860, devoted entire chapter to voice cultivation. Pages 107 through 123 specified that ladies should speak with soft, moderate pitch and avoid loud or harsh tones that suggested lack of refinement. These gendered standards persisted into broadcast era. Early radio stations preferred male announcers and restricted women's roles to specific programs deemed appropriate for female voices. CBS memo from 1934, preserved in network archives, specified that women's voices should be used primarily for domestic programming and should maintain higher pitch and softer tone than male broadcasters. The phenomenon of vocal fry, creaky voice quality produced by relaxed vocal cords, became controversial when adopted by young women in 2000s. Linguistic research by Ikuko Patricia Yuasa, published in 2010, showed that vocal fry was equally common among men and women, but media criticism focused almost exclusively on women's use of it. Articles in New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Atlantic between 2011 and 2015 criticized young women for using vocal fry, calling it unprofessional and annoying. This gendered double standard revealed continuing vocal regulation of women. When women adopted vocal patterns that deviated from traditional feminine norms of higher pitch and breathier quality, they faced criticism that men using similar patterns did not encounter. The controversy demonstrated that women's voices remained subject to standards not applied to men. The question that persists. After more than a century of vocal standardization, the question remains whether the benefits justified the costs. Standard pronunciation facilitates communication across diverse populations. Broadcasting and telecommunications required some level of consistency. Professional contexts benefit from shared linguistic norms, but these practical benefits came at cost of diversity, authenticity, and equality. The specific standards chosen reflected existing power structures rather than neutral linguistic principles. The voices elevated to standard status were those of educated, middle, and upper-class speakers from specific regions. Other voices were marked as deficient and requiring correction. The process was not neutral technical adjustment, but was exercise of power, determining whose speech would be validated and whose would be stigmatized. The fact that this occurred through ordinary institutional mechanisms rather than through explicit conspiracy makes it more significant, not less. The most profound transformations of human behavior occur through accumulation of seemingly reasonable decisions that collectively reshape fundamental aspects of how people live. The standardization of voice succeeded so completely that most people now perceive standard speech as natural rather than constructed. The work required to create and maintain standards has been forgotten. What remains is system, where some voices are heard as authoritative and intelligent, while others trigger negative judgments, where some speakers can use their natural voices in any context while others must constantly monitor and modify their speech, and where the burden of adaptation falls entirely on speakers whose voices deviate from standards rather than on institutions and individuals who enforce those standards. Understanding this history does not necessarily indicate what should be done about current linguistic hierarchies. The standards exist. Changing them would be difficult and would create complications. But understanding that they are products of specific historical processes driven by identifiable institutions and interests rather than natural facts about language opens possibility for making different choices about how we value linguistic diversity and whose voices we recognize as legitimate in professional, educational, and public contexts.